Mr. Derek Veenhoff.
He's better known as
Deek.
Drinking liquor with DJ Deek, we out laughing.
Yo, Deek.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Deekast, episode 92. I'm your host, Deekast. I'm here with Dr. Dan Wilson of the Debunk the Funk YouTube channel. How's it going, Dr. Wilson?
Doing great. Going well. How are you?
That's good. That's good. Me too. We got a lot to talk about today. So I'll talk about how I found out about you first. Now, you've got a growing YouTube channel, and Dr. Kevin Folta retweeted one of your videos, your series that you're working on now, the Disinformation Dozen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're about, you say you're halfway through or past halfway now through this series?
I think this coming week is going to be number 7 out of the dozen. So
nice.
Getting close.
Yeah. And so why don't we give, for people who don't know you, more of your academic background and a little bit of, your personal background, if you will.
Sure. Yeah. So I got my PhD at Carnegie Mellon University studying biological sciences. Specifically, I was doing a lot of hardcore molecular biology. So ins and outs of how certain molecules work, particularly the ribosome. But I don't want to get too technical with that stuff.
Sure.
But that's what I studied during my PhD. And now I work in industry. I work at a company called Eurofins. And on the side, I just do this YouTube channel called Debunk the Funk, where I go over things that frustrate me in the that I see out in the news about people misrepresenting science or misinterpreting science, and in some cases, outright lying about science to profit from it. So that's kind of my attempt to add something more meaningful to the use my degree for something more meaningful than working a 9 to 5.
Totally. And you're doing an amazing job, by the way. It's it's tough for people to parse through this stuff. So to have somebody like you that's really like doing the work and sort of organizing it for people and putting it honestly in pretty plain English, you don't get too technical unless you have to when you're being specific. And we'll get into who the Disinformation Dozen is and all that. But and we're going to talk a lot about COVID and vaccines today. Obviously, that's the topic of the day, and that's a lot of what your videos are focused on because that's just we're in the middle of the pandemic, or hopefully the tail end, we might say. So, but I wanted to touch on, you've mentioned before that you used to be a conspiracy theorist.
Oh yeah.
I would kind of say I was as well, maybe more in my teen years. So would you tell people a little bit about that and then how you got into science and how you changed your mind?
Yeah, so definitely in my teen years as well, I kind of drifted into being a conspiracy theorist. And then I got super obsessed. So what happened was I watched the documentary Loose Change on YouTube, all about 9/11. And I got sucked right in. Both my parents have higher degrees. And so I was always interested in science and education, but I was pretty terrible at it in grade school. But seeing that documentary made me feel like I was being let in on something that no one else knew about. It made me feel like, smart, I guess.
Right.
But it was really the thrill of like seeking truth that really sucked me in, because it revealed this whole other world that I thought was totally real. I totally fell for all those things in Loose Change. And I got obsessed. I would argue with people online about it in comment sections a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it to the point where it was like unhealthy, but eventually, because I was interested in science and education, I ended up, wanting to pursue that. And eventually, I'd say towards the end of my high school years, I got better at understanding science, thanks to a really great teacher. And so as I started learning more about how science is done, and that, scientists are always asking questions, and they're probably asking the same questions that conspiracy theorists are asking. But the difference is that scientists do the work to actually find the answers to those questions. And they do it in a way that uses the scientific method. So it's rigorous. It's asking, if this is true, then how do we disprove it? What would disprove it if it were not true? They come at it from that angle, and they just are kind of relentless with it. And so as I got more and more into science, learned more and more about how it works, understood more about it, I kind of drifted away from that conspiracy mindset. And it wasn't immediate. It was gradual. And I'd say it didn't even start entirely with, in the classroom. I'd be arguing with people online, and they would bring up a point that I just couldn't address. I knew deep down I couldn't address it, but in the moment, there was no way I was going to admit to some random person over the internet that I was wrong.
Right,
so
right.
Stuck to my guns and just was like totally sticking to this idea that 9/11 was a conspiracy. And but it planted kind of a seed of doubt that over time, and by learning more about science, grew into this, okay, I was definitely wrong. That's definitely not true. And gradually I came out of it, and continued scientific training in college, learning how to actually work in a lab and do experiments, how to think like a scientist. And that continued into my PhD, where that kind of PhD training teaches you that, you're probably wrong about almost every hypothesis you're going to make in the lab.
Right.
But you have to go out and test it. You have to go out and do the experiments to find out, okay, all this stuff I just told my committee in my thesis proposal, all that's probably wrong now, now that I tested it. So I have to go back and rethink things. So, sorry, that's kind of just my journey from conspiracy theorist to scientist.
Now, that makes me think of a lot of different things. But so for you, do you know what camp you fell in as far as 9/11? Did you think that George Bush had orchestrated it? Or did you think that, because there's different camps. Some people think the planes were holograms, or right? There's different. So was there one thing that started the cascade for you that you can remember? Or
so I definitely thought that some people within the US government had orchestrated it. I never thought the planes were holograms, though. That was actually I had been into it for a good while before I heard that for the first time.
Yeah, it was it wasn't a super early one. It was a little later on that came about. But the big thing with 9/11 for me, I mean, the whole jet fuel can't melt steel beams has become such a meme these days. But
right.
It's a false premise where they say, because you don't need to melt the beams, you just need to bend them such that the building collapses. And so it's those kinds of false premises that you run into a lot with all these things. And I'm sure I could guess as you became more scientifically minded, you probably employed a lot more of those tools to break those things down, because some people might not understand why would science help you to determine who did 9/11, but because it's more of a political or sort of actionary consequence thing with different actors, like who is responsible for this thing. But I could see that just the rigorous thinking and sort of the admitting you don't know and then looking for real evidence, right? Right. One small example that people always bring up with 9/11 is the insurance policy that was taken out a month before, or whatever it was, a week before, by the owner of the buildings, which when you look into that, it is a standard insurance policy that all buildings have that renews every so often. Right. So,
and I believe he actually lost money after all was said and done. So,
right. Exactly. So, but I guess we don't want to spend too much time on 9/11, but so I have a number of notes here I wanted to go through. I wanted to, if we could do a speed round at some point to get through a lot of the debunking things, because I know we could spend hours on each thing, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the techniques or the rhetoric that, say, anti-vaxxers, Covid-deniers use. And one thing I see a lot is gish gallop, the gish gallop technique. And if people don't know what that is, as far as I understand it, it's when you're debating somebody and you use, say, 10 or 12 different points in rapid succession, so sort of confusing the listener or your opponent, such that they might forget some of your points, and therefore, they can't fully argue against it. And so I see this a lot with some of the Disinfo Dozen that you've been debunking, where they're doing that. They're also employing a lot of like almost yelling, maniacal laughter. Tucker Carlson does that a lot, random maniacal laughter. Just these different sort of, animated voices and surprised reactions to what they're saying. And I just find, I don't know, what do you think about that there's all these techniques that they use like that?
Yeah, there are definitely common tactics that lots of people similar to the Disinformation Dozen use. And one tactic that I've been kind of noticing more and more lately is a lot of them will reference or claim to reference science. And while they're referencing this science, they'll say they admitted it. They'll say the scientists admitted it themselves, or just they admitted it when talking about something. And that, to me, is starting to become more and more of a red flag, because almost always, if you look into it, it's either a quote mine. They just plucked a quote out of context and are using it incorrectly, or nothing was admitted. Like, it's just completely misconstrued.
And you're implying, by saying the word admitted, you're implying that they did something nefarious and then now are copping to this,
right,
guilty plea of whatever thing you're.
Exactly. Yeah. It's totally making it out to be this nefarious thing that was suddenly brought into light by saying they admitted it. And it's never really the case. I could just name one example where a lot of conspiracy theory memes or Facebook posts lately have been talking about the CDC admitting that they changed their PCR test to specifically for people who have been vaccinated. So for those who don't know, the PCR test, there's a lot of terminology going around in the media that scientists have been familiar with for a long time, but basically the cycle threshold, the CT number, which I'm not sure how many people have heard of, but I'm not
we
sure
talked
how
about
many.
it on the show a bit, so people might be familiar, but yeah.
Okay, we can go more into what that is if you want, but basically the claim is that they lowered the CT number, so they made the test less sensitive for people who have been vaccinated. That's not true. Nothing of the sort was admitted. The people are referring to a document where the CDC is asking for clinical samples so that they could sequence coronavirus that has been found to be infecting vaccinated people. And in order to sequence that virus and in order to work with it, they're asking that people send them clinical samples that were positive with a CT value of less than 28, or less than or equal to 28. So no criteria for what's positive has been changed. None of that. And no guidelines have been changed. They're just asking for very specific samples because when they get the samples, they want to be able to work with them right away. And if there isn't enough virus, then
we talked about false positives and false negatives as well on this show. We had a gentleman who was a lab tech who did the show, and he works in a COVID lab, and he sort of explained that as well. And that gives me thought on another general point, which is with anti-vaxxers or conspiracy theorists regarding COVID, how much of it is just straight up lying versus just misunderstanding? Like, to me, it seems that there may be people who have motives. Maybe they're trying to sell a book or something like that, but we can't really say 100% of these people are just trying to sell a book. Some of them must be just misinformed and not understanding the science. In fact, in some of your videos, we show some of these guys talking, they're almost asking, as they're saying these points about coronavirus, they're asking themselves, is this right what I'm saying? Or they're seeming confused in the science. And sometimes you will pause there and you'll break it down for people, like where they are confused. So yeah, what do you think about that? Like, are they just misinformed? Do they have agendas? Like what?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I honestly try to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially having been a conspiracy theorist myself, where I genuinely believed what I believed, but it was never, I never felt like I was the bad guy. Of course, I always felt like I was, believing what was true and trying to expose the truth or whatever. But, I do think that at some point there are some people in that COVID conspiracy space who are total grifters, who just capitalize on misinformation. They profit from it, and they have to know they're lying. They really stealthily pick around certain scientific terminology, certain quotes, and they very strategically cherry pick things in a way that when I listen to them, I think there's no way that they did that on accident. They must have pulled that out purposely and misrepresented it. And I can only think of a few names that I've debunked where I'm convinced that that's what's going on. But most of the time I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. They might be misinformed. They might misunderstand. And the thing I try to remember is that this is really genuinely unprecedented. This is a huge pandemic, and so many emotions, so many things are going into it that can just really upset people. And having that out, having that idea that, maybe there's not this virus out there that we have to worry about and change our lives over. It's actually just a lie, or some variation of that idea. That can be more comforting than the reality of, yeah, there's a virus out there and we have to deal with it.
So how can we make sense of like Judy Mikovitz, I believe the Plandemic documentary lady is. Oh, yeah. She actually is a virologist, like a PhD. Is that correct? Like, didn't she actually work with Fauci? And there was she got arrested for forging or stealing her own documents or something like that. But people will say, oh, well, this person's, a doctor or a PhD or a virologist, and they're saying that COVID's not that bad or COVID doesn't exist. Or isn't there always like 1 to 2% of anybody in any field who believes and something that is incorrect? And how is that even possible? Like, if you could break that down at all, I don't know what you think about that,
Yeah. So the story with Judy Mikovitz, I'll just touch on that first. Yeah, she's a virologist, and there's no evidence that I know of that she actually worked with Fauci or interacted with him in the ways that she claims. It could be true, but I've seen no verification of that. She did work with one of the scientists who was at the time leading one of a few scientists around the world who was leading the discovery of the causative agent of AIDS, which turned out to be HIV. But she never really published anything groundbreaking as a graduate student or as a postdoc in that person's lab, which, that's not a dig on her. It's just most graduate students don't end up publishing groundbreaking work. And the only reason I say that is because a lot of people try to paint her as one of the most accomplished scientists of all time, which is not true. But then after that, she kind of went out of science for a little bit, and then suddenly got hired by these people who wanted to start researching chronic fatigue syndrome. They were wealthy philanthropists who wanted to start a research institute for chronic fatigue syndrome, and they hired her because they met her because she was bartending on a yacht or something.
Right.
The story goes something like that.
Yeah.
But as the head of this research institute, she claimed to have found a viral cause for chronic fatigue syndrome. And the paper actually got published in Science, which is still one of the biggest impact scientific journals you can publish in. But over time, that story unraveled. That virus was found to not actually cause chronic fatigue syndrome. It was found to not cause much of anything, really. And it was found to be a contaminant, a common lab contaminant. And it was a big deal at the time. I mean, there are plenty of news stories written about this at the time, because they thought that it was really important that there was a virus found to have caused this syndrome. But as science does, they reviewed the data. People could not reproduce it. People could not find out that this virus actually caused these things. And so her story unraveled. That paper was retracted, and she actually got fired from that research institute that was started by those philanthropists. And the whole arrest thing, she apparently kept some confidential lab documents.
Yeah, something minor, but still kind of strange. But yes.
Yeah.
Now, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, but the overall picture here, right? Like, yes, she's a virologist. Yes, she has a degree. But you don't want to have to look into the background of everybody who says something questionable, right? And you might not necessarily find anything weird about their background. They might just be an expert who has a degree who says something weird. But I think what a lot of people need to understand is that scientists generally don't talk to the public. Scientists generally have this attitude of, I'm going to work in my lab and I'm going to produce good work. And if I'm going to talk to people outside my lab, it's going to be colleagues, it's going to be people at conferences. It's going to be people who understand science, maybe science reporters. They're not really going to go out of their way to talk to the general public on mainstream news or anything like that. That's an attitude that is changing. I think it's not all encompassing in science, but the attitude is very strong within the community. So when you get these people who loudly speak out against quote unquote status quo things about coronavirus, they're going to get a lot of attention because they're saying these inflammatory things that are on the surface, almost exciting, right? It would be almost more exciting to believe that some of these conspiracy theories are true.
Yes, totally.
Right. So they're inflammatory, they're attractive ideas. But scientists aren't going to really go out of their way to come out of their labs and fight this stuff, because part of the reason is because scientists already have a huge to-do list. They, I don't know if any of your listeners know like the path to being a scientist, but it's not very glamorous. Like, you don't make much money as a graduate student, but you're encouraged to work 10-hour days. And then as a postdoc, you don't make much more than you do as a graduate student, but you're still encouraged to work long hours. And if you're not working those long hours, it's kind of frowned upon in a lot of labs still. So a lot of scientists don't have the energy or the platform to go out and challenge those people who are saying the ridiculous things that scientists know to be ridiculous. Most scientists are completely content by saying those people are crazy and stupid, and then they laugh about it with their lab mates and move on.
Yeah, which is a big topic, and it comes up on the show and just in my personal life a lot, because I'm not a trained scientist, but I have close friends that are trained scientists. But it's this thing of that you like the science communicator is a newer thing. We have famous guys like Carl Sagan or Neil Tyson and Dr. Kevin Folta, shout out to him, and yourself. Hopefully one day your channel will grow and all that. But it is a field that is like you said, there's a disconnect between the average citizen and then scientists and people who practice science. And we need to bridge that gap because it creates dangers like vaccine hesitancy and different things like that come about, which is, I would assume, why you're doing this work is to sort of lower those dangers around the world and get people more. This is what this show is about too, or what I try to be about, is getting excited about science, even if you don't fully understand it. But the technology that we have access to today is amazing, and we should take full advantage of that. And we're like superheroes. Some of us, not myself, but the scientists are like superheroes in that we've created these utilities that can defeat pandemics and that. But of course, you have people that don't like lockdowns, but then they don't like vaccines. And so then they're stuck with a pandemic. So now, and Judy Mikovitz, she also is one of those people who says, I'm not anti-vax, but ... right? And she speaks at anti-vax events and all this. You run into this a lot lately. This statement, I'm not anti-vax, I'm just anti-COVID vaccine. Like, in fact, a lot of these people, they say, I am vaxxed, I take the flu shot, or I take measles, although all those are fine, except the COVID vaccine is an experiment, which is another falsity that, even myself, I don't take the flu shot, not because I'm just lazy. I just haven't got it.
Sure.
As I can remember. But I'm super pro COVID vaccine because I'm a DJ and I need my gigs back. It's my, one of my things, but so could we maybe do like a speed round where we kind of jump through a couple of these, COVID, denial things, or these.
Definitely. Sure.
And then we won't spend too much time on each one, but maybe people who are listening who are like concerned about some of these things. So, and some of these you've covered and others I haven't seen you cover yet, but so event 201, right? There was an event at like a fire drill before a fire. They do a reenactment of something to determine if they're prepared for it. So there was one of these about COVID, and like you said in one of your videos, it's just like doing a fire drill. It's a common practice.
Exactly.
And I think this is also related to the idea that 5 or 10 or 15 years ago they were warning about a pandemic, therefore it was planned. I mean, it just seems so like, I think that's an easy one that we can just gloss over now, because I don't know what else to say about it. Like they would say this about, like Alex Jones used to say this every time there was a shooting, school shooting, or there was 2 shooters or 1 shooter. And then he would say, oh, I just found out a week ago they did a shooter drill. So that means it was planned. And I was always like, I don't really get the logic there. Like,
no. Yeah. I mean, it's totally the same logic as saying, oh, this building burned down, but a month ago they had their annual fire drill. Like, okay, right. So what?
It's just another event that happened in proximity in time to this event.
Right. And the worry about a pandemic that has been around for longer than the last 5 or so years. I mean, it's been, scientists have understood that pandemics are a huge threat for a really long time. And we've been dealing with, what we call zoonotic outbreaks, or diseases that come from animals. We've dealt with AIDS, HIV. We've seen Ebola emerge. We've seen Zika emerge. We've seen other SARS viruses emerge. And even before then, we've seen, you can name very ambiguous and scary viruses if you look into their stories, like Nipah or Hendra, or herpes B even is a really concerning story. But the threat has been there. The threat has been there for so long, and it even freaked out President George W. Bush back in the early 2000s, because after the anthrax scare, he started getting all worried about biosecurity. And he learned about the threat of a pandemic bird flu. And so bird flu is, of course, influenza, but it's a type of influenza that has very few historical cases in humans, but the very few cases that have happened have had a really high mortality rate. So up in like the 70% mortality rate. 50 to 70, I believe. And so that's huge. That's actually terrifying. to think what might happen if the bird flu suddenly got better at infecting humans. Would it still be as deadly, and how bad would that be? I mean, it freaked out George Bush. So he started, really preparing America for a pandemic, and that those efforts continued into the Obama administration. Unfortunately, they started to get funding for them started to run out during the Trump administration, and he chose not to continue those efforts and sometimes actively cut those efforts. But
yeah, which is another thing that people deny, that say that didn't happen. But I mean, again, you just look at, there's a track record of these things. I don't think
there is, yeah.
And I mean, COVID, relatively speaking, is a mild pandemic. Now, I'm not saying that it's mild.
I totally know what you mean.
Yes,
yeah.
And so some people might misunderstand that, but what I mean is, like you said, that they've been warning about a pandemic. There will be another one. Mm-hmm. And depending on whether that's 10, 20, or 50 years in the future, we may or may not be well prepared for it. Maybe people will forget the mistakes of the past, right? But I remain optimistic. And from what I've heard, what people think is just that because we made certain mistakes for this pandemic, that we're going to be ready for something next that comes along, right? And it could be, relatively speaking, worse than COVID, right? So,
right. Yeah. And because in a sense, we got lucky that the next big pandemic in our lifetime was COVID and not something worse. Yeah. Because, if it was bird flu, we've had millions of people worldwide die, with the COVID mortality rate being, we think, somewhere around 1%. That number is not going to be definite until later, when the data become more clear. But if it were something like bird flu, which, as I said, has a mortality rate upwards of 50-70%, that would be that'd be the zombie apocalypse that people imagined. Exactly. I would think, And
a lot of what we talk about here, this common thread is sort of, I think, why people are divided, is just your sort of perspective on the pandemic generally, that either it's mild because it's a 99% survival rate, or it's severe because it's it's hard to get through to people who don't think it's serious that it is serious. And mm-hmm. I think the effects that we've seen are with all the restrictions in place. So, people need to really take their mind out of this timeline and put it into a counterfactual timeline where we did not put restrictions or take any efforts to stop it, and think what would happen. And you got to understand exponentiality. Virus doesn't just spread 1-to-1. There is a exponential factor, which mm-hmm. here in Ontario, in our province, we saw we had a third wave because we opened things a little too soon. In February, we got a giant third wave, which now is hopefully going to zero, and there's going to be no fourth wave. Hopefully, all this. Canadians are good at taking their vaccines, we're learning. So mm-hmm. Things are going pretty well. But let's smash through a couple of these. So COVID-19 came from a lab in Wuhan, this level 4 lab, which Dr. Kevin Folta actually visited. I heard.
Did he? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So now this thing, the problem with this thing is, I've read an in-depth Reddit post from a PhD in virology who explained the various reasons why it couldn't have come from a lab. And it seemed very black and white and pretty straightforward. It didn't seem like we were pretty sure it didn't come from a lab. It sounded like, the evidence that they gave was that it's just basically impossible. And some of the evidence that was coming out that it did come from a lab was that, workers there got a cold a week or two before and things like that. But you have guys like Brett Weinstein, the one brother there he is again in this field, mm-hmm, and he keeps saying that it came from a lab. And you hear a lot of these talking heads more and more bringing up this concept that it came from a lab, or that it couldn't have come from an animal, or because we don't know exactly which animal it came from, therefore, it must have escaped from a lab. But I don't know what you have to say about that.
Yeah. So, in my mind, there are two ideas on that end. There was the idea that it was engineered in a lab, and there's the idea that it escaped from a lab. And the idea that it was engineered, I mean, that's pretty easy to say. Like, no, we're very sure,
because it would have been more. It would have been more if it was engineered.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have been so. What's the word? Not as effective. Like if they would have engineered it better, but nature just made this thing that was sort of strong, like sort of effective, but not really.
Yeah. So if all you have to do really is look at the genome of the virus. So when scientists look at the genome of the virus, we find that it's completely consistent with evolution. We find that, it matches certain sequences that are found in other known coronaviruses in ways that tell us that this virus probably jumped from bats, which was its original host reservoir, to other intermediary hosts. So, for example, like pigs and birds are intermediary hosts for influenza. And the virus might jump to one of those animals before jumping to humans. With COVID, with coronaviruses, they can jump to lots of different animals. So coronaviruses are found in snakes, bats, pangolins, turtles, mammals, like little palm civets, which are like raccoon cat things. You can find coronaviruses in lots of different animals. So you look at the genetic evidence, and it tells you that this virus probably, over a long course of several decades, jumped around from bats to possibly one or more intermediary hosts before making its way through humans, either from those intermediary hosts back to bats and then to humans, or what exactly, we don't know. But there's no evidence in the genome of direct manipulation. As far as leaking from a lab, you start to see a lot of headlines now about people saying, oh, it's possible. And I think people are interpreting that to mean like, oh, people are really considering this. It's well, no. In my mind, the lab leak idea has always been theoretically possible. Like the idea that the virus naturally came from an animal to a human and then started spreading throughout the human population, that is technically not discounted in a lab leak scenario. You could imagine a scenario where an animal was brought into a lab, a worker got sick, or the virus somehow otherwise leaked out of the building, and that's where the pandemic started. That's theoretically possible. Is it likely? I don't think so at all. The reason being, the Wuhan Institute of Virology is a BSL-4 biosafety lab, level 4 institute. They have a lot of precautions. And yes, those precautions are not perfect. However, with all those precautions, you compare it to a wet market, a live animal market, where you have animals being shipped to the market. You have illegally poached animals being shipped live to the market and kept in cages in close proximity to each other. Defecating, urinating in close proximity to each other, spreading potentially viruses between each other. And you have humans walking around, buying the animals, slaughtering the animals. I mean, it's been identified as a really dangerous hot zone.
So we're comparing both of them, relatively speaking. Now, this level 4 lab with a lot of precautions and a wet market with the animals mixed and no precautions. I mean, right. What is more likely, right?
Exactly.
And then even if they did let it leak, I mean, isn't there going to be a whistleblower somewhere, or they would have found out by now? It's been.
Yeah, that's exactly the other thing. To assume that, to say that, oh, I'm weighing this idea that it was leaked from a lab really heavily. You have to kind of assume that there's been a big cover up, right? You have to assume that all whistleblowers have been silenced. You have to assume that the lab actually had the virus, and that all investigations so far into the samples that other people have gotten their hands on from that institute were somehow, hiding the coronavirus. So
The other thing is the China. There's this anti-China sentiment that has been brewing for maybe a decade or more or longer, right? And that it also creates this false premise where we're saying, well, it's China, so they're just covering it up or they're lying about it because it's China, and that's just what they do. But I mean, you got to understand, this is just like every country. We talk about this. We have the government, and then we have the people, right? It's Chinese people, our people as well, people who work at the lab. Like, they have altruistic motives as well. They're not all just trying to cover things up for their government.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear you say that, because I think it's kind of, I mean, it's dangerous to start saying like, oh, it's China, so you know them.
It's a lie, or whatever they say is a lie, kind of thing. Yeah. Right.
I mean, but you could easily you could imagine someone in a foreign country easily saying the same thing about the U.S. Like, oh, it's the U.S., the CIA, shady history. And yeah, sure, that's true. But we're people. We're not,
Yeah.
We don't think that the U.S. is all bad or all about secrecy. So, maybe China is a little bit more secretive about things, but to assume that an entire nation that one of the most populated nations in the world is keeping all these secrets airtight, it's a little bit of a leap, right? So
yeah, I just think there's this thing people forget about, that we do have a globalized society now, and nations do need to rely on each other and work together, and there's sanctions that go on between them, and there's the possibilities of war. So they do keep their spies, and they do keep things secret in that, but not everything. They do also have to sort of work with the community in that. Just like when the coronavirus started, the Chinese scientists started working immediately with doctors and scientists in the US and abroad to start tackling, they sequenced the genome and they shared the information and all that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
What about this sentiment now that people say, young, healthy people don't need to get the vaccine? Because if the people who are vulnerable are vaccinated, then we're all good, right? Come on, let's.
That's really, it's disappointing for me to hear certain people saying that. So yeah, I mean, it's true that young, healthy people are less likely to suffer severe disease from the virus, but you're not safe from it. And the two big points is that, one, you're not safe from it. You could still have a severe disease, or you could have long COVID. You could have long lasting detrimental effects from the infection. The second important point is, it's not just about you, right?
Surprise.
None of the precautions we have, including vaccines, are 100% effective. They're not going to work for everybody. So if young, healthy people, which is a large portion of the population, don't get the vaccine, not only are you going to have some people who are the unlucky ones who have severe disease or long COVID, you're going to have this kind of pool of the population where the virus is able to spread and evolve. And eventually that's going to endanger even the vaccinated. The virus has potential to evolve to a point where it no longer is affected by the immune response that the original vaccines have put in place. And also the people who maybe didn't get full protection from the vaccine because, again, it's not 100% effective, are also at risk. So it's at the end of the day, it's irresponsible to say, I'm young and healthy and I don't need the COVID vaccine, and you don't need it either. Like
yeah, and you'd be surprised. I mean, there are a few people who say that. I put out a post recently of just calling on my 30-something cohort to just, let's get the shot, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people very positive, and of course, a couple negative comments. And that was the one thing that they're hung up on is, people are afraid of the AstraZeneca blood clots. And we just try to say, compare that to the possibility of blood clots with COVID, or let alone birth control or smoking cigarettes and all that. Right. These are the things that people need to think about. And again, it's trusting the experts, which some people are confused about this, but experts in public health and the field of virology and that, and epidemiology, all that, they're telling us that the people who invented the vaccines are saying, this is why we invented them. We'd like you to use them this way, please. And then the public is saying, no, I don't think that that's how they should be used. It's like, it's not your field. Like you just don't have it. But they think there's this anti-expertise thing that's been brewing as well. And I struggled to wrap my head around that because people, like somebody said this to me, oh, the experts, like the ones who brought us into the Iraq war. I was just thinking, like, Colin Powell? Like, so Colin Powell is not telling me to take the vaccine. Like, that's not, I think people get confused about government and sort of this body of scientists. They think that, oh, you're doing what your government's telling you. Therefore, like, reductio ad Hitlerum or whatever that thing is, where they reduce everything to Nazism or Hitler.
Oh God, yeah.
Right. So you're trusting your government blindly. Therefore, you are slaves and all our sheep and all that. But no, we're trusting experts in the field of science who study this stuff, and Right?
Yeah, like I get comments all the time on my videos, like, "Oh, so you trust the government?" No, where did I say that? No, I'm not talking about the government. I'm talking about data. Like, data is what I work with. Data is what I understand. So that's what I go to.
Yeah.
I don't just trust.
Yeah, the government's just listening to, well, they should be as much as possible. Sometimes they don't, but listening to the public health experts as to what is the best way to go. Because I always say this too, politicians have a job to keep too. They don't want the public to all hate them. So they're going to try to stay in power by, like, let's agree that they're power hungry. Right. So
Sure.
how do you stay in power? You please the people, right? In a democracy, at least, unless you're in one of these countries that, forges their vote systems or whatever.
Right. And so the only other thing there is, like, some people who are distrusting experts are trusting people sorry, let me start over with that. Some of the people who are distrusting experts are distrusting experts because an expert told them so. And like, we just talked about, the Judy Mikovitzes and people who say these things, and then people hear them and think, oh, well, this person has a real virology degree. Maybe I should listen to them. Meanwhile, you have literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other equally, if not more qualified experts saying the exact opposite. They just don't have a platform like Judy Mikovitz does. And so understanding that the expertise is definitely in one camp, and these few loud voices are at complete odds with that, is something that I think is really important for people to try and navigate in this COVID landscape.
Yeah, and maybe should have said this at the top of the show, but I'll put it in the notes that the Disinfo Dozen is apparently responsible for 65%. There are 12 people that are responsible for 65% of the disinformation about vaccines. And there's been articles that have come out about this as well. So how did we determine that? Like, how do they measure that percentage in that?
So I actually didn't look too far into their methods there. It was a nonprofit group called the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They apparently did they tried to find the origins of specific claims. Yeah. And like, I don't know how that stuff works. Just
measure impressions and interactions or posts and followers, that kinds of different social metrics, social media metrics, probably.
Yeah. Like they have methods of tracing who retweeted what first and all that stuff. Yes. So
moving on to a couple more of these let's go speed round with some of these vaccine passports or the vaccinations. Now, people keep yelling about this forced I don't want to take it if I don't want to, right? Or I don't have to take it if I don't want to. I don't think forced vaccinations was ever a concept, like a real plan. I don't think because I just think that they have already determined at the beginning, like, we're not going to try that. No one's going to go for that.
Yeah.
Right. And then maybe you could talk about what your opinion on passports is, because what I seem to glean so far is that there may be some forms of international passport, but there are privacy concerns in the US and Canada and different in Europe, and that it probably won't be something like where you need it to go to the movies or to a concert, although some people are supportive of that. But do you think that'll be a thing, or what are your concerns there?
I think that's really hard to enforce. I don't think it's going to be a thing where you have to have a vaccine passport to go to a concert. I don't think it's going to reach that level. Will it reach a level where you need to have something like that to go to a different country? That's possible. That's because that already happens. If I want to go visit my family in Southern Africa, I have to have certain vaccines. I have to, they require that. If you want to go travel to India, you have to have certain vaccines. You have these things already in place. Vaccine passports are already a thing. And even with universities, if you want to attend certain universities, you have to be up to date on your vaccinations. You have to provide those records. So, there is a precedent for it. It wouldn't be hard to incorporate into existing systems, but it's not going to be a thing where you can't go anywhere without being vaccinated. No one, all those weird cartoons where they're holding you down and vaccinating you. That's fear mongering. No one's going to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's kind of what I would say. I do have, some friends of the show, will say, that have said those types of things. And my thoughts is it's too much for them to even worry about. Like, I mean, I guess for concerts, you could see maybe, because we already have our tickets on our phone. So maybe having some sort of digital wallet with your vaccine proof is not that much of a big deal. But I just think it's, especially because of, at least in Canada, let's say, I believe about 91% of people either have a shot or are going to get it, or maybe not right away, but we'll wait a little bit to get it. There's only a small percentage that really don't want to get it. And I know in the States, it's a little larger percentage that don't want to get it. So, but I mean, I think we're seeing how effective the vaccines are. Right. And so, like, I mean, we may just not need that, because it may be the vaccines are going to be so widespread that perhaps or hopefully COVID will just sort of ultimately be defeated and won't come back for round 2. I don't know. Yeah.
With the way things are going now, hopefully, COVID will be pushed down to a level where it's completely manageable.
Yeah.
And that's always really been the goal. You don't want to have this situation where you're yo-yoing from, okay, we're plateauing at a few thousand cases a day to, oh my God, now we're having tens of thousands of cases every day. You just don't want that situation to happen.
Yeah.
And we're hopefully getting to a point where we'll keep it at a low plateau. So yeah, I don't really see vaccine passports being like a part of everyday life ever. I just don't see that being feasible or enforceable. Even local grocery stores around here have said, have put up signs saying, if you're vaccinated, you're not required to wear a mask. But they don't enforce that. There's no one checking to see if you have your vaccine card on you.
Yeah,
at the door.
I think we just need to give each other the benefit of the doubt on a large scale. Like, I mean, for myself too, when I get the shot, let's say if I get my first shot, maybe I should wear a mask all the time still until they tell me not to, but I'm still going to use my own risk assessment, my own judgment to, sort of say, when I get 1 or when I get 2, I'm just going to not. Right. And I think that number of people who are not going to get vaccinated, but also don't want to wear a mask is just got to be small enough that it won't really matter at that point.
I would hope. Yeah. I mean, I'm fully vaccinated right now, and I still wear my mask out just because I don't trust people. Honestly.
Yeah. And that's your personal risk assessment, I guess. Right. But
yeah, it is.
And this is a confusing time, the whole pandemic. I mean, we talk about all these different camps of beliefs and fears and different things, and it's hard to stay up with the news. It's hard to stay up with the science. It's changing so fast. And I don't really blame people necessarily for being confused, not understanding something. I just, like yourself, I do blame people who purposely put out this stuff that some of them know it's false, or they really need to do more critical thinking before they start saying, or accusations really is what they're doing, is accusing people, right. Society on a large scale of various nefarious, wrongdoing. So
yeah, those people I have little patience for, but I have infinite patience, I would say, for people who are, confused, genuinely, because I will be one of the first to say that the messaging during this entire pandemic has been poor. The science communication has not been great. At any stage, I think.
Well, even right now, isn't there still things that are confusing people? Like, I mean, the WHO and the CDC seems like they're not even learning their lesson as they go as far as how to communicate effectively. But maybe that's just one of the biggest challenges that we have as a society is how to communicate these complex things to the average person.
Yeah, I mean, in graduate school, when you're working to get your PhD, there aren't very many efforts that I know of, because I've talked to tons of other graduate students in other departments at other schools, asking them like, hey, does your department train you on like how to communicate science effectively? And if they do, a lot of them don't, but if they do, it's geared towards effective communication towards your colleagues, right? It's how to present data in a slide that is clear and concise and gets your main points across. But there is practically zero training, at least that I know of. There are probably some universities that have programs for this, but very few have dedicated efforts to train their graduate students, their young scientists, to communicate with the public, right?
Yes,
people
yes.
who have little to no scientific background. And that hurts. That hurts society, I think. And even me, I was always really interested in science communication, and it was tough to add that to my list of things to do. And I would even have my finger wagged at me sometimes by people saying like, that's kind of a waste of time. That's not going to get you a job. And it's like, well, but I think it's important. I want to communicate science to people.
Totally.
Because if scientists don't communicate science effectively, then, we're not there. But what if we make some life-changing, life-saving drug, and nobody wants it, nobody trusts it because we have communicated so poorly? I mean, that's a extreme scenario, but that drives me a lot to be like, well, I don't want that to happen. I don't even want, 30% of the population to say, I don't trust that, therefore I'm never going to take it. That hurts. That's not good.
That's a great point.
So,
it makes me think about the comparison to historically, when just literacy itself wasn't widespread, right? When only the priests and the leaders needed to be literate, and eventually everybody had literacy, but maybe scientific literacy is sort of the next revolution, where we need to find out a way to make it widespread. And then, like we said earlier, there's many people in this space that are like pioneers, but we need like more, I guess. We need to be more of an important thing. Maybe we could close on this topic generally of just the death count of COVID and sort of how it relates to the falsity of doctors getting extra money just to write down COVID or multiple death certificates. We could talk about the 6% myth. And the death count that I just read about. The overall deaths globally are up like 2 to 3 times the COVID death count. So whether that's uncounted COVID deaths or perhaps other deaths just related to the pandemic, that's it. So a lot of people who are COVID deniers think that the count is much less than the official count, but actually scientists think that the count is much higher than the official count. So it's a lot there, but I don't know if we could go into that a bit.
Yeah, totally. So that's been a thing since the very beginning, I think, where people think that the count is inflated. And it was weird to me at the start because, people were questioning whether or not the cause of death was actually COVID. And one of my first few thoughts on that was just, so do doctors suddenly not know how to determine the cause of death?
Yes, they've all lost their ability.
Like signing the death certificate and listing a cause of death is a big deal for a doctor. I mean, it's a big deal for the whole medical staff and team that goes into that decision. So the idea that they suddenly just didn't know how to determine the cause of death was weird to me. But people ended up getting confused about co-morbidities and things that were actually the cause of death and not COVID. And so the 6% number that you referenced, that comes from this idea that 6% of COVID death certificates have only COVID listed as the cause of death, which, as far as I knew at the time that I researched that, that's true. But the comorbidities are things that are often directly caused by COVID. So, you can go into the CDC data, which I have linked in some of my videos, and look at the rate at which comorbidities are listed in death certificates. The most common comorbidities are pneumonia and respiratory failure. Those are two things that COVID can directly cause. Because when a virus like COVID infects you and causes severe disease, it's ravaging your body. It's destroying, it's damaging your lung tissue. It's your immune system is getting overwhelmed by it. Your immune system is being hyper responsive to the point where it's damaging your own body. So you're sustaining a lot of, assault from this virus from multiple directions. And that makes you vulnerable to bacteria infection. So then people get bacterial pneumonia because they had a COVID infection. And then that's what ultimately kills them. That doesn't mean that COVID didn't kill them. It's splitting hairs, really.
It caused the thing which killed them. They have this condition, plus they have COVID, and it's So
my analogy is always like, okay, so if you, by that logic, you could argue that a gunshot victim didn't actually die from, bullets. They died from blood loss. That's what killed them. So
yes, so bullets don't
really
kill
have
people, just blood loss.
Yeah, it's like the relationship between these things are completely missed by people who say those kinds of things.
Yeah, the other thing they say, which is this anti-human, I don't know what to call it, but the whole idea that you heard from the beginning of it's just old people dying and fat people and people who eat bad food all day. It's their fault for not being healthy. That's why they're dying. And I was always like, do you have grandparents? Like, do you not?
Yeah,
just don't care. But if they're 80 and over, like, see you later. Like,
it was wild to me. Like, whatever people could say to not change their way of life was crazy. And but to some extent, I get it, right? Like, this pandemic did affect people's livelihoods.
Yes.
It sucked. People lost their jobs. People had to completely change their jobs. People were sent into mental stress, and totally, I get it. And it would be great to just say, like, it's nothing to worry about. Let's get back to life. But, the irony to me is that if we did just acknowledge it as a collective from the very beginning, acknowledge it as this threat, and do the hard work to take the necessary precautions,
New Zealand style.
Then we could have been looking at a much shorter timeline. We could have been looking at we could have really been looking at a month or a few weeks of lockdown instead of what it turned into, which was kind of a half-assed response that didn't really do its job because it was half-assed. So
the other irony is people who are obsessed about, as they should be, about the economy and their livelihoods and their jobs. If you just let COVID run its course with no restrictions, that all would have been destroyed as well to a greater degree. And I believe economists mostly agree on that. I mean, it's hard for people to picture counter-factuals, or it's hard for them to realize that, say, in Canada, it's only killed 25,000 people only. But how many would it have killed if it would have just been able to, if everybody got infected? Because also some people at the beginning said, everyone's going to get this eventually. We're all going to get infected. It's just a matter of fighting it off. And that it's like, that didn't happen. Not everybody got infected.
That was never the scientific stance. It was never everybody's going to get it. It was like, this is going to be really bad if everyone gets it.
Yes. Yeah.
So but you're right. I think we've heard the same information that economists have calculated out, like what's the economic cost of losing all these lives, and it's way more than lockdown.
Yeah, totally.
So
one final thing that I just thought of, didn't want to miss this one, is vaccine patents, or the nature of patents themselves and how it relates to big pharma and funding and this kind of thing, or profit in general. Like, how should people think about patents when it comes to scientific things or patenting nature and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because it's one of those things that I don't think about too often. But from what I understand, patenting in pharmaceutical companies is a good incentive for them to fund the really expensive research that it takes to actually get a product to market, because then they can actually, make money back from all their investment. And with the case of COVID vaccines, as far as I'm aware, ideally you wouldn't have a patent and everybody would be able to get it. But as far as I'm aware, there are workarounds to please both the companies and have as many people get it as possible.
Right.
I don't know too much more about the specifics on that.
I guess I'll have to get someone like a patent law guy, because there's this headline: Joe Biden calls to waive vaccine patents. This will harm development. Right, I heard about that, and again, I'm not too well versed on it either. But there's this concept that I think just like patents are evil; they're just to make profit, right? And it's like, I think there's a reason for them, and big pharma. This is kind of speaks to the that there's a cure for cancer and they're just keeping it a secret, all that stuff, because people want to think that people can only make money off of disease. They can't make money off of cures for disease.
That's not so. I think that's always a really interesting claim, because I know of an example where there is a practical cure for a kind of cancer. It's a specific kind of cancer called chronic myelogenous leukemia. And before this drug was invented, that cancer was practically a really painful death sentence. It's really sad to hear the accounts of what that was like. But Novartis, big biotech company, and this researcher, Brian Drucker, ended up, through a long story, inventing and patenting and selling this drug called Gleevec. And people who have that chronic myelogenous leukemia and are on Gleevec, upwards of 90 to 95% of them go on to live normal lives. And that was really powerful. But Novartis makes a killing off that drug. They make so much money off that drug. So the idea that, and Brian Drucker, the researcher associated with that drug, by the way, has been very vocal about his problems with how much money it costs to be on that drug. But the idea that pharmaceutical companies can't make money off of cures, quote unquote cures, it's
almost
true.
One of the problems, actually, right? Like you just mentioned, that a drug could be prohibitively expensive. Like, there's so much profit to be made that's actually another problem that we're facing, is that depending on which country you're in and your health insurance situation and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so, yes, I mean, there's no reason that companies can't make tons of money off of cures, because a cure is going to be in high demand, right? And I think what a lot of people have to understand about vaccines is that vaccines as a moneymaker they're not good as moneymakers, right? Ideally, a pharmaceutical company, you hear about a lot of the corruption and stuff with pharmaceutical companies. It has to do with things like painkillers, opioids.
Purdue family and
yeah. I mean, there's very real stuff. So I'm not surprised that people think these things, but and they have total precedence too. But you know, vaccines are just not great money makers because drugs like pain,
right? They're very cheap to make.
They're cheap to make and they're cheap to sell. I mean, vaccines are not expensive. Most people can get them for free if they have health insurance. So they don't really make a killing, and you know, it's a couple doses and you're good for at least, you know, a while. It's not like you have to. It's not like hospitals are constantly going to be ordering lots and lots of this medication to give to patients on a daily basis.
Yeah,
you know, it's just different volumes. So they're not going to be making as much money off of vaccines as they are off of a drug that treats the illness, right? So because also if you're in the hospital getting treated for that illness, not only do you have to have that drug that that is going to treat you for, say, COVID, but you're also going to be getting other things while you're in the hospital, right? You're going to be getting fluids. You're probably going to be getting other little medications here and there. So there are lots of other places where they're making money off of you, essentially. But if you get vaccinated and you never have to go to the hospital because you never get sick, the bill is a lot cheaper.
Totally. You've mentioned this concept too of not being allowed to question things, which is something you hear from sort of anti-vaxxers, right? Like we're only arguing with them because there's, you know, they're not allowed to ask questions. And you've mentioned on your channel before that like asking questions is the basis of science. Like it's what we do on a regular basis. It's just a matter of how are we finding the answers? Are we finding it with peer-reviewed studies and replicating studies, or are we just finding it from some Plandemic documentary, right?
Right. Yeah. I can guarantee you, right, that almost any question that a conspiracy theorist might ask about vaccines or COVID or whatever, a scientist probably asked that same question. And you can probably find somewhere in the literature data that answers that question. You know, it's of course really tough to sift through literature sometimes, but I would bet that the answer is there. For example, with the antibody-dependent enhancement, which is something that conspiracy theorists have been going around for a while with this vaccine and has been making people hesitant to get the vaccine. This idea that getting the vaccine for COVID will make you more susceptible to severe disease once you actually encounter the real thing, that the immunity that you granted to you from the vaccine is going to enhance the disease somehow. I say somehow, but we know how it happens. But it's a real phenomenon, and scientists ask the question, do we need to worry about this? And it was specifically addressed in animal studies during development of the vaccine, right? They gave COVID vaccines to primates, non-human primates, and then challenged them with the SARS-CoV-2. And there was no evidence of disease enhancement at all. So that's a clear example of, you know, conspiracy theorists are asking this question.
Yeah.
Scientists asked it too, but they found the answer.
Then that's the difference, is that they'll ask you a question as a viewer of their documentary, you know, what about this and what about that? And it's like they're posing the question as if it hasn't been asked or there is no answer. But I just encourage listeners, or if you have a friend that thinks this way, just, you know, if they have a question or they're confused, because often people say that too. I'm just confused. You know, why is this? And it's like, it's okay to be confused. Just you admitted you're confused, and then go research, you know, the answer to that question. It's totally fine.
Right. Yeah, it's totally okay to be confused. And yeah, I just want to say again, like the messaging has been poor. So I totally get being confused. I mean, I say now and again, you know, I never thought that I would be debunking this much stuff about PCR.
Right.
Right. So PCR, polymerase chain reaction, that's a technique that I learned in a lot of detail, you know, throughout college, and I used it a lot in my graduate work. And now it's a household name, PCR. People say COVID PCR tests are flawed for this and that. And it's like, wow, I I had no idea that it would get to this. But I mean, it's a complicated technique that's not obviously explained to a lot of people. So they just hear these headlines or hear conspiracy theorists say things very confidently, and it's easy to fall for. I totally get it. I totally get being thrown off by it.
Yeah, and I think just the general humans are very enthralled by cinematics, by movies, and when we watch documentaries, it's the way they put it together with the music, and then there's also this feeling of, well, they're making this whole production around this. There's no way it could be based on lies, because how could they get away with that, right? That's kind of at least how I sort of got into a lot of different things, was just sort of believing the face value productions like that. But we've covered a lot of ground, Dr. Wilson, and we just want to say thanks again for taking the time. And let's plug your YouTube channel again. It's Debunk the Funk. Is that correct? Yep.
Debunk the Funk on YouTube. I'm on Twitter at the same. And I got a Facebook called Doc Wilson Debunks.
Awesome. And we're looking forward to the rest of the series of the Disinformation Dozen. When can we expect the next one to drop?
Yeah, so the next one, I'm doing Ty and Charlene Bollinger. It's going to drop on this coming Tuesday. So it'll be, May 25th?
Something like, May 25th. Yeah. Cool. Can't wait. And for everybody that's listening, go check out the channel and be encouraged. Encourage yourself and others to ask questions, but just know that there may be answers to those questions. You just maybe haven't found them yet.
Yeah, scientists are hyper-competitive nerds who love to ask questions.
Totally. Hey, thanks again, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Derek. I really appreciate it being here.
Yeah, take care.